So welcome to another exciting edition of the ESQ Practical Law Academy webinar series. We are glad to have you here today, and my name is Chidima Agu. I'm a Research and Development Associate at ESQ Trainings Limited. At ESQ Trainings Limited, our mission is to expand the frontiers of continuous professional learning. We offer courses and trainings across various areas of practice, which we have categorized into academies like the Litigation and Other Dispute Resolution Academy, Intellectual Property Academy, Energy, Oil and Gas Academy, Corporate Law Academy, Capital Projects Academy, and amongst others, Capital Markets Academy. With this webinar series, the Launch Hour webinar series, as they're slated to hold at 1 p.m. during lunch break. They will hold 3 times every week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. However, in order to accommodate our Muslim participants, the Friday webinars will hold at 11 a.m. And after every session, we'll provide resources in easily accessible format on the go for everyone who's interested. Also, currently, there's registration is ongoing for our training on accounting essentials for lawyers, holding 9th to 10th of March, and registration is 75,000 naira. And reporting essential for lawyers in capital market transactions is another of our training, holding 11th to 12th of March. It's also 75,000 naira. To get more information, please send a mail to c.agu@esq-law.com. So the topic of today's webinar is on financing energy projects in Nigeria, and talking about where the pipelines are and what are the challenges. And our seasoned facilitators will advise professionals on the new industry trends and skills to flow into the new normal. On today's topic, we'll be looking at. We are privileged this morning to connect with some of our panelists, and if you have any questions while the webinar is ongoing, please type in the Q&A or raise your hand. So it is a great delight I introduce our speakers. My learned silk, Mr. Uchiobi, Managing Partner at Alias Law Practice, Mr. Omosi Fred Omojule, Head of Legal and Chief of Staff, Energy Group Limited, Energy Group UK, Mr. Chukwemeka Osuji, Head of Gas Department at Olanu Ajayi Law Practice, Mr. Ayodele Oni, Partner at Bloomfield Law Practice, and our able chair and moderator today, Mr. Oyebode Ayodeji, Partner at Aluko and Oyebode. Mr. Adeji is a partner at Aluko and Oyebode. He does mergers and acquisition and capital market practices. He provides advice to the firm's clients, principally on debt and equity capital market transactions, mergers and acquisition, private equity, corporate restructurings, and regulatory compliance. Mr. Adeji, thank you for joining us today. And Mr. Akindeji, I'm so sorry, not Adeji. Yes, thank you for joining us today. I'll let you moderate the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chidima. Very quick one. I typically get this confusion. My name is Akindeji Oyebode. I'm a senior associate and team lead at Banwani Godalu. I'm standing here in place of Ken Etim, who's the managing partner of the firm, who was scheduled to be the moderator of this panel. Unfortunately, he had to be airborne at this time on very short notice. Thank you very much, our distinguished panelists, Leonard Silk, Mr. Uchiobi, SN, Fred Omosi Omojole, Chukwemeka Osuji, and Dr. Adilioni. Essentially, we're here to discuss challenges and prospects in financing energy projects in Nigeria. This is particularly important at this period because we're coming out of a COVID-induced reduction in productivity globally, which has impacted oil and gas and power transactions globally. Essentially, up until recently, I think today the oil price is about $67, which shows that it's picking up back as markets are gradually opening up to productivity. And so we expect that at this period, Nigeria should be taking steps that ensures that it remains a bride for channeling investment to Nigeria. This is extremely important now because even our neighboring brothers, Ghana, Angola, and other East African countries are essentially making their markets attractive to financing of energy transactions. So it's time that Nigeria as well has to take all those steps that would encourage both local and foreign participation in the market. If you look at the sector, I mean, back in 2008, I remember working on the first draft of the petroleum industry bill. This is 13 years after, and we don't yet have a signed bill. So that shows that there's been some slack in the progression of the legal framework, particularly for the oil and gas space. Um, and generally speaking, there are just always different challenges from a legal and regulatory framework for ensuring that there's sufficient investment in Nigeria. So what we're here to discuss today, with the aid of our able panelists, is to see what are those challenges, how can we fix them? Do we need to, what are the legal challenges that we need to cross? What are those hurdles that we can tick off and then ensure that there will be increased generation of projects and increased project financing in our space. And I'll respectfully request that each of the panelists gives an opening remark, just to essentially tell us in 2-3 minutes their ideas on this topic. And I'll progress with, as they do typically in the courts, with our learned silk, Mr. Uche BSN, to just briefly give us his opening remarks on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. I can, Digi, and my regards also to Ken. Wish him safe travels. Again, morning participants. I would like to comment that funding is essential and indeed the life wire of the energy industry. Just as the energy industry is the life wire of any particular economy, irrespective of the jurisdiction involved, you need energy to drive the economy. You need energy to build infrastructure. You need energy as a source of national income. And so in so many ways, economies across the world are essentially dependent on energy. It's just a factor of where the leaning is. So the next thing to note is that funding is very critical, and the mix of funding that you need will be a factor of so many considerations. And the types are equally different. We have the funding that are autonomous to the companies, such as shareholders loan and other kind of things. We equally have the ones that are external. You have the ones that come from the traditional lending institutions. You equally have the ones that will come from the capital market. You have a hybrid of these. By the end of the day, what is essential is that you just need to assess this, leveraging what you have, and after appraising all the risk factors and mitigants, you can now assess the kind of funding that is accessible to you and the ones that your project can attract. Because again, bankability of projects are essential to attracting the right kind of funding. The payback period and other kind of factors are equally essential. On this note, I think I'll stop here and then allow my colleagues to intervene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonard. I think I'll pass the mic over to Fred Omojali. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Fred.
How's that? I was looking at the topic and it says, what are the challenges and where is the pipeline? And I suppose in a very short response, if you fix the challenges, the pipeline will appear. But I assume that you want me to say a bit more than that, and I suspect ESQ would not have me back if that's all I said. So I think in the Africa power space, focusing on Nigeria, I think you made a very valid point that there is regional competition amongst the countries in terms of attracting capital. In Nigeria's context, I think we've seen that if a deal is well structured, it's going to get financed. So the problem in the Nigeria power space is not demand, because there's a huge population and a very high power supply deficit. So it's not the capital, because capital is very reactive to opportunities if the IRRs and the terms of the investments are right. A lot of the international investors have a huge dry powder and they're looking to deploy capital. So if you look at the value chain, it's not the demand problem, it's not the capital problem. So I think it's the intermediate section of the value chain. And what I mean by that is the ability for the Nigeria power market to bring into fruition bankable transactions that can easily get financed. Now, Azura is probably one good example in the market that demonstrates that point. But the challenge is, how can we get more Azuras to come to financial close and to get developed successfully? I think Nigeria's power market is at a crossroad at the moment. The reason being that we've had a first in market transaction, which is the Azura deal. It was clearly, heavily bootstrapped in terms of risk protection, government support, and reasonably so because it was the first transaction in the market. I think the Nigerian government, as with most governments in the Africa region who have done first in market transactions, are looking at themselves to say, okay, we've closed a deal that, in the cold light of day, was heavily, structured. We've provided all this, government support and a high tariff comparative to maybe other emerging market jurisdictions. And we have to look at debt sustainability. So I think that's the issue to my mind, as to why we haven't seen more Azura type transactions come into play. But I guess my conclusion on that opening remark would be that the government has to, and power stakeholders have to dance a delicate dance. And what I mean by that is that in terms of the tariff, it needs to be calibrated. It needs to be sufficiently attractive enough to attract investment into the sector, but not too high such that debt sustainability for the government is a problem. And around the government support and things of that nature, it's also a delicate dance. The more credibility a government has in terms of its contractual performance, macroeconomic stability, the less likely that investors are going to ask for government support, political risk insurance, and things of the like. So the solution lies in the dance. And the question is, can we get that dancing right? Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very interesting opening remark. I'm sure we'll dig deeper in detail when we go ahead. I'll move over to Chukwemeka to give his opening remark. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I'll just, I won't say too much. I'll just start off from where Fred just finished. And pretty much, I guess most people have a fair sense of as to what the market requires or what is required to be done to get us from where we are to where we want to be in the short and in the long term. It's more a question of whether we are willing to or able to do what is required. And when we're talking about what is required, I'm talking about the participation of the various stakeholders in the value chain. It's also important to consider that, yes, Nigeria has its own peculiarities, but project financing is project financing. If you want to set up a project, there are certain considerations that are central to project development. It doesn't matter. You cannot wish certain of those considerations away. All you can do is to identify them and then find a way to mitigate some of those concerns. They can't disappear altogether. So I think, importantly, particularly, and also speaking, in the gas space, but generally in the context of project development in the energy sector, I think it's important for us to, and when I say us, I mean stakeholders in the industry, to begin to pay more attention to some of these points, and then to articulate them in a way that the message is clear. I think the messaging has been ongoing for decades, if I may say so, but it appears there's a disconnect, and there are two broad spectrums. From the perspective of the host government and regulators, their approach to project development is entirely different from the perspectives of the market players. And these broad divisions in approach is actually what informs the tension, competitive tension that you see between these two participants. On one end, one is more concerned with maximizing returns and rents and making sure that the projects are developed within the shortest possible time and everybody's happy. On one end, the people who actually have to spend the money and do the work are concerned with making sure the projects are viable.
I think we may have lost you, Kwemeka. Okay, thank you very much, Kwemeka. I appreciate the thought process, and I'm sure when you come back, we'll probably complete statements. Pending his return, I will move over to Dr. Ayodele Oni. Okay, I think Chukwemeka is back. Okay.
Yes, I'm back. I'm so sorry. Let me just quickly round up. I'm not sure what happened. We must find a way to take government a little bit across the line so that we can all together, and I mean the both stakeholders across the divides, to come up with what are fairly acceptable structures which can bring what's one central point, which is key, predictability. One key concern with investing in Africa generally and in Nigeria in particular is lack of predictability. You're not sure where you stand in the next 5 to 10 years. You know what the laws are today, but you're not sure where it's going to end up. You know what the regulatory framework is today, but you're not sure where it's going to end up. So I think if we begin to have more of those discussions around predictability, it will then make it easier for us to begin to see the results that we deserve. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Massively appreciated. Move over to Dr. Oni to give his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be taking it from both an academic, a theoretical, and a legal point of view. I think if you remember what Frank Alexander said, Frank Alexander is a very old energy lawyer. He said that several years ago. He was talking about the 3 pillars of investment: right to monetize, stability, and enforceability of your rights, particularly via international arbitration. Now, do we pass all of these 3? Do we even pass any? Is there stability in our laws? Maybe not, particularly because of issues around the PIB. The PIB has been on for forever. And if anyone wants to come invest, they need to be sure that even if the laws are bad, then they can structure the arrangement around the law. But if they don't even know what the law will be in 2 or 3 years' time, and it may be fundamentally different from what it currently is. So I agree with Alexander, Frank on that point. On the point of also enforceability of your rights, you go to, can you really trust the court system? That's a question. So whether you are investing in form of debt, equity, whatever it is, then the question is, can you really trust the court system? Or in terms of international arbitration, can you enforce it in the country? And thirdly, your right to monetize the interest you've got. How easy is it? Now, on those 3 levels, as long as we do not do a great job, we do not get an A, or at the very least a B+, then we will run into problems. It's either government says there will no longer be a PIB, and we would work with the current legislation for the next 10, 15 years, or something is done very quickly. Otherwise, there'll be no stability, because no one wants to come to invest in a climb where they are not sure what would happen in 3 years' time. No one wants, the court system too needs a lot of work. No one wants to come and know that if I do have issues with my rights and I go to court, I'm not going to get justice, or justice is good. Justice, when you delay justice, people will say you've actually denied justice. You hear stories of court cases for 40 years, for 20 years, commercial matters for 10 years, for 15 years, for 20 years, moving across from the High Court to the Court of Final Jurisdiction. So those 3 issues are critical to my mind when you begin to talk about raising financing, having the opportunity to do projects, particularly in the energy sector, whether it's oil, whether it's power, particularly upstream, where you need a lot of collaboration, where you need a lot of foreign direct investments. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oni. Always nice to hear from you, particularly with your Alexander quote. Thank you very much. We'll move over to Mr. Dayo Idowu to give his opening remark. Thank you.
Um, Thank you very much. Sorry I joined very late. I was catching a flight, and Nigeria flight was delayed by 2 hours, so I just got in now. So I'm sorry not to have joined at the beginning. I will align with what the other panelists have said, Leonard Senior Advocate, and also what my brother Ayo just said. But I'll just pick on one thing he said: the issue of stability and certainty. Case in point, if you look at how long it took for final investment decision to be taken on LNG Train 7, it took a long time. And these are based on issues around market fundamental issues about stability in the market, certainty in the market. The last big project in the upstream sector was 5 years ago. That was Egina, about $16 billion project. Since then, nothing has happened. Bunga Southwest has been waiting for almost 6 years for final investment decision to be taken on that. Zaba Zaba is still pending. We don't know where we are going to go. We don't know if the oil majors and the operators are actually waiting for PIB to know what fiscal implications that's going to have on this project. But that aside, but looking at the topic, I just wanted to make a remark from a completely different perspective. I think in 5 to 10 years, or maybe a bit, that's a bit short. Let's say in 10 to 15 years, everything we're saying is going to be completely different. We may be struggling to find anyone that'll put money on a fossil project, fossil energy project. I remember in 2003, there was a talk about a coal powered plant in Enugu. We're actively looking at how that was going to be funded. But today, nobody is going to fund a coal project. All the banks are now signatories to the Equator Principles. Nobody will touch coal. These Equator Principles look at social and environmental implications on projects. Now, fossil fuel is slowly going down that same route. Most of the projects I've worked on involving European development banks in the last 3 years have significantly been exclusively in the renewable space. They're dealing with solar, wind. In Europe, wind in Europe, here in Africa, definitely not wind, but mainly solar. You're looking at the World Bank with its scaling solar projects. They're looking at solar farms which are coming up. I mean, we've signed 14 PPAs for solar power to the grid. So that's likely going to be in the future. In Europe, for example, by 2035, most European countries are going to stop using internal combustion engines. China, 2035 as well, internal combustion petrol engines are going to stop. President Biden, first 4 weeks in office, signed one of his executive orders saying that all federal government agencies in the US will convert to electric cars. The world is moving in that direction. So we need, as a country, to start bearing in mind that the changing landscape in terms of environmental and CO2 reduction targets will soon start to affect oil and gas projects. We will very soon start to struggle to find any funding on energy projects. So even if you look at the big operators, Total and all these guys, they all have a big renewable research business right now. So as a country, I think that is a key thing to bear in mind. So we're talking now about 2021. By 2030, it's going to be a completely different conversation. So that's just my brief opening remarks for now.
Thank you very much, Daya, for the different perspective. We all know that renewable is the future. So we'll dive right into it. And once again, I'll start with the Leonard Silk. Considering that some of the conversations we've had here have to talk about the legal and regulatory framework. Leonard Silk, do you think Nigerian laws in the energy space are currently satisfactory to encourage investments into Nigeria?
Thank you very much for that question. But I think the answer to that should be in public domain by now. Obviously, our current laws are suboptimal. If we even go back history to find out that, look, the main petroleum law we have in this country today is over 50 years old. And so it's quite obsolete. And within this period, the industry had moved on. So certainly it cannot be said to be sufficient. And of course, that is why we have the PIB today, which has been lying in the parliament for well over 12 years. Unfortunately, this is a revolutionary kind of legislation that would have moved the industry forward. The last time I checked, over $180 billion are lost, have been lost over a period of 12 years, 15 billion annually, terms of investments that would have come to this country. Simply because we have not been able to pass this PIB. Now, it would have been better that we did not even introduce this bill at the time it was introduced 12 years ago. Because as past speakers have said, Emeka, for instance, and Ayodele Oni, all alluded. Ayodele said instability in the laws. Emeka said predictability. But for me, uncertainty is probably an all-encompassing word. Investors would not take final investment decisions when the laws and the regimes are uncertain. So you don't even know what to run your economics on. If we had only the 1968 law, it would have been predictable. We would still have been having investments coming in. Challenge was by announcing that we want to have a new primary legislation governing this industry, and then delaying this process, everything then became fluid and become unpredictable. And that would drive most international investors away. I was at an event in London organized by some of the top colleges, universities there. And I met a certain lady, who is high up there in one of the financial institutions. And then she told me she had $2 billion for Africa then. And I said, oh, madam, that's great. How much of this is coming to Nigeria? She said, no. I said, why? No, this has nothing to do with PIB. Then it was because this country had announced, or probably they were tinkering with the issue of whether to devalue the currency or not. And she said, look, if I bring in money, $500 million, $1 billion, suppose you people go ahead and then devalue your currency as being suspected. Then on the spot, I see myself losing a third or even half of the investment. What do I tell my board? So that environment is not safe, it's uncertain. You can't build any more model on it. So that is one thing about this PIB. Now, we have tried to introduce this PIB. There have been promises that it will pass within Q1 this year. We're in March. Q1 is almost coming to an end. I don't know where we are, whether we have to roll this into several other quarters again and continue the roller coaster. I thought that there should be a definite end to this so that we can have this legislation, whether it is imperfect or imperfect, but at least we solve this issue about uncertainty. And looking at the legislation in question, I think that I could break my comment on it into three broad segments. One, governance and regulatory framework. Then the salient commercial issues. And then, of course, the fiscal regime. On governance and institutional framework, I think they got it right in the sense that there is now the Minister of Petroleum, whose overbearing powers have been moderated a bit. Then we have the Nigerian Upstream and Regulatory Commission that, of course, take care of the upstream businesses. And then we also have the Midstream Regulatory Authority, which takes care of, the midstream and probably the downstream to an extent. And then we then have the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, Company Limited. No more the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, but the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, which is the NNPC that will be unbundled and charged with the mandate of transparency. The shares of NNPC the government would divest some of their holdings in NNPC. They cannot be majority anymore, because if you are majority, investors can't come in. So government would dilute the stake so that they become in the minority. And then the government stake will now be sold through some processes that will end up at the capital market. I must say that as a capital market biased lawyer, this thing will have to be done carefully. We need, yes, those shares to be put on the boss of this country, but at the same time, we need to watch the absorption capacity of our local boss. They may not have sufficient absorption capacity to take up those NNPC shares in one full swing. So we will be looking at a situation of probably a staggered unbundling process, which I see drafters of PIB have not averted their mind. Another thing that I think would happen is that the much talked about corruption and the lack of transparency in the operation of the corporation can be minimized. Because from all I have read, for instance, Ayuk, who is the executive chairman of African Energy Chambers, in the outlook of 2021, had this to say. He says that just need to reform the petroleum sector perceived to be corrupt, non-transparent, and inefficient. So this is coming from such a notable personality. So I think that PIB intends to address this and fix this gap. On the salient commercial issues, there are quite a number of them, too difficult to address in an occasion like this. But a key one is that the PPL and PML will now be introduced. And then we will now be doing away with the old OPL and OML, which I think is a very good development, considering that this country hadn't got the kind of sophistication we have today at the time we embraced those OPL and OML. And it would be extremely difficult to alter or change this fundamentally right now. And the best way around it is to do away with those and introduce new regimes. And lastly is on the fiscal regime. The most important thing about this fiscal regime is the policy trust in the PIB. It talks about progressive fiscal regime that would encourage enterprise, build the industry, and allow those that actually invested to get sufficient rewards. Those are the broad issues that I discovered that are germane and to the PIB that is currently being worked on. But I think that what is essential at this point is to ensure that all the stakeholders galvanize their efforts and then do what they can do to ensure that we get this legislation out. I've had occasion of speaking to a wide range of E&P executives, operators, and the consensus was, look, whatever it is, let's see the much we can do and get this thing going. There are quite a lot of other things that can be done after that, because for there to be any particular law, there has to be there had to be a number of subsidiary legislations, guidelines, and other kind of things. So those matters of details that are not of vertical significance can be addressed at that stage. But let us get this going. As it's today, the country is bleeding. We're losing investments. We haven't got a good set of laws, and we are also scaring people because we are telling them we'll do it for 12 years, but we'll never get to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for a very detailed explanation of the issue. And just a quick take from what you said, and also flowing from what Dr. Ayodele said as well earlier. Sometimes bad law is better than no law, because with bad law, people can plan around it. But no law, no one knows what legal and regulatory framework governs whatever investments that have been undertaken. So the jury is still out there that should we have even thrown away the entire PIB and reverted to the 1969 law, even though outdated, due to the delays and the constant communication we get saying it's going to be passed this year, it's going to be passed this quarter. And the last public hearing, we saw certain drama, at the National Assembly just on this issue, So the jury is still out there. We're hopeful. I believe that if the government actually has the opportunity to pass that law, this is the time. The National Assembly has, this National Assembly has at least passed several laws that have changed the regulatory framework in certain aspects, the new CAMA and the like. So we are hopeful that at least before the end of the year, that we'll have a petroleum industry bill in some form. So thank you very much, Letio. I'll move to a topic that is very dear to my heart, and I'll ask Fred. So the power sector, I mean, we all have generators in our houses, inverters, and everyone keeps wondering what's happening. Why can't we finance a power plant? We heard about Azura. Why can't we have another one? I've worked on a transaction that has stalled for a while. Yes, we've talked about the macroeconomic issues, but we've also seen where lenders are more comfortable in just mirroring the landmark transaction. So every lender wants every security or securitization that Azura got. Every lender wants the PPAs that Azura got. What are those things from a policy and regulatory perspective that Nigeria can do to essentially encourage investments in the different sectors of the value chain in this power space? And how can investors like you as well become more comfortable knowing that the market has changed since Azura happened, so you may not get the exact Azura transaction documents and securitization? How do we balance the two? Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, I think just to continue with the dancing metaphor, I think the government and the stakeholders need to come to the dance floor. And why I say that is because both sides are sitting at the opposite ends of the dance floor, and the government is saying, we did this for Azura, we cannot do it again because that was a first-in transaction, and every other project is now de-risked because there is a template that shows that we can successfully procure and execute IPPs in Nigeria. Fair point on one hand. The investors are saying, well, there's still systemic risk, so we want the same protection. So this is what I was saying in the opening remarks. So just to continue on that, I think what both sides need to do is calibrate. And I think they need to meet in the middle somewhere. Obviously, the government is the one looking for the funding from the international investors, so it needs to compete. And by competing is, as I was saying, it's either on the one hand, they provide the evidence of stability, certainty, predictability, which all the panelists have echoed previously, or they provide a contractual backstop if the predictability, certainty, and stability does not exist. So that's one point. And that backstop we've seen as the put call option, such that if there's an adverse expropriationary conduct of the government, whether it's actual or creeping expropriation, the investors are secure that they are going to get adequate compensation. So if there's a track record of, and if the government can possibly demonstrate that there is no track record of expropriationary conduct, and we've said creeping expropriation, which could be change of devaluation of the currency or change of laws or uncertainty of laws, and all of those things still exist. So there's a legitimate basis for an international investor to say, we want to put a call option because we're not secure that the economic terms that we model before investing will change simply because of political reasons. And we have a 4-year political life cycle in Nigeria, and a lot of these investments are 10, 15, 20 years. So I think the issue of put call option is quite controversial, but interestingly, government support is not foreign in other countries. So a few years ago, I worked on a transaction in the UK. It's called Thames Tideway. It's a big infrastructure project, one of the largest in Europe in the last 10 years. And the British government had to put in place a government support package because there was a concern that there is not a big enough insurance market to insure this multi-billion-dollar project. So all governments everywhere need to strike that balance between, can they guarantee investors confidence, or do they need to put in place contractual protections to provide that comfort? So that's the first point. I'll make just 3 points. The second point is an international investor will not just invest in power generation, which seems to be the focus. An international investor is going to want to look at the total value chain of the power industry. And if we break that into 3 components, we'll look at, actually, let's break it into 4. We'll look at the interface with the oil and gas sector in terms of gas supply, given most projects are thermal IPPs. I think we have an abundance of gas and we have strong, credible gas suppliers. And then it takes us to the generating segment of the value chain. And this is where a lot of international investors like to invest. And simply because, you can bank on a strong EPC contract, a credible EPC solution, and you have your gas, and then that's your project. So that's the reason why the generation space attracts a lot of international capital. But then what is critical to the power value chain is actually the source of liquidity, which is further down the chain, which is the distribution, because they collect the revenue. They're the gatekeepers of liquidity in the power market. And even probably more important, or just as important, is the transmission, because we currently don't have a very strong transmission infrastructure. And that results in a lot of leakages, technical losses, and there's some political sensitivity given how critical transmission is. So international investors looking at power opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa see the attractiveness of the demand potential, given our population and the ability to solve that problem. But they also see the leakages in the transmission space, the leakages in the distribution space. And that is probably deterring some investment there. So I think what we can do as stakeholders in the power space, along with the government, is to find ways in which the distribution companies can improve their collections, can improve their service, can win the trust of people to port from generators to trusting the grid. So I think that's the second point. And then the third point is just to echo what my colleagues have said, which is the macroeconomic issue is important. I think Ayodele was talking about ability to remit your earned interest, and that speaks to the heart of the currency issue, the devaluation issue, parallel currency, black market rates, the ability, even for some PPAs like the Azure, where there's an indexation to US dollars and you structure around the currency devaluation issue, there's still a problem of shortages of dollars in the market and your ability to repatriate those dollars. So these are all things that international investors will look at, and they come under pressure, international investors, to say, we have this amount of cash, we need to maximize our IRRs, we need to do it in an efficient way. And it's probably no surprise that you've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, lots of projects being closed in countries like Kenya, Ghana, because for whatever reason, they have had a better pipeline and maybe more certainty with the government support side of things. And final point is to talk about the sustainability issue and the oncoming energy transition and how that presents opportunities in the power space. I think that to talk about what one of the colleagues said was, when we talk about fossil fuels and renewables, I think I agree with the estimation that it could be up to 10 years. Although the DFIs have backed out of fossil fuels, you, however, have the commodity traders who have stepped into the gap. And because they naturally can't spot the opportunities, they are providing a bridge until Nigeria fully migrates, the world fully migrates from fossil fuels to renewables. And then in the renewable space, looking at the Paris climate obligations, it's important for us to be realistic as well. Renewables are great and they're helpful, but renewables has some challenges as well. Renewables is intermittent at best. The sun does not shine 24 hours a day. So we still need thermal power plants as a stabilizer of the grid. We still need thermal plants because you can't have solar panels on every, powering every home. But also, more importantly, in order to develop industry and manufacturing output, you need a heavy base load of power generation, which renewables may not be able to provide. So there's still something to be said for gas production in Nigeria to be used for thermal IPPs. So it's not all doom and gloom, but we need to move quickly to monetize and put the structures in place. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you very much. We continue to hope that the macroeconomic issues, which are beyond some of us, are resolved as soon as possible. And hopefully that would encourage more foreign investors bringing in funds into Nigeria. I'll move over to Dio. And so my question for Dio, so NNPC, that's probably the biggest Nigerian oil company, right? We are aware that the government has entered into certain agreements with the World Bank, which probably restricts their ability to create security over some of its assets. How has that impacted the ability of government to raise funding for its national oil company? Also, what are the other initiatives that you think that government or NNPC can look into in order to increase the liquidity that will be available for the development of oil and gas projects in Nigeria?
Thank you very much. I won't speak specifically just to NNPC. I would say most developing countries that produce oil and gas who have in the past, which their sovereigns have in the past taken on multilateral loans, are in the same boat as Nigeria. So for the last 35 to almost 40 years, most of these developing countries, Nigeria, Venezuela, the likes, we've all got World Bank, IMF loans, and there were strong restrictions on your ability to borrow, which, essentially it's a carryover from your typical lender restrictions on borrowers. So essentially what the World Bank did in most of their credit documentation and policies was that they restricted the ability of any of these sovereigns or their national corporations from securing their assets in respect of, for example, securing their assets for any third-party lender or prioritizing any third-party lender above those multilateral agencies. So, of course, lawyers and financiers are very creative. And that's how one of the various structured financing options was adopted by most of these national oil companies, which are essentially is the same as what you call securitizations. Essentially, you sell what is yet to be produced. So today, for example, if I'm an oil company, a national oil company, I could just borrow money and say I want to use it for field development, and that's it. And I give security. Rather, they created very unique structured finance solutions whereby they forward sell their products. So I, for example, a national company, have a field I want to develop. And the cost of developing that field, taking on debt and equity, let's say it's $2 billion, I will forward sell up to that debt in terms of production from that field. So you have this forward sale agreements or purchase agreements which essentially sells what is yet to be produced. And these structures are premised on common law, which Nigeria, of course, also follows, and basically the Sale of Goods Acts and principles of common law. So you sell what you are yet to produce, and as long as it meets certain criteria. So the test was what they call the true sale test. And the reason why that test is important is because if you have a sale and eventually there's a dispute or an issue, and that sale, that your supposed forward sale, is recharacterized as security, the risk for those who are lawyers on the call, they know that if you create security, for example, you don't register that security, there's a risk that that security is void against other creditors and the liquidator. Now, to avoid that risk of a recharacterization, which makes the sale invalid, it must meet the true sale test. So it must be an absolute sale, no equity of redemption and things of that nature. So if you meet that true sale test, then your forward sale works essentially. So if you forward sale, then you take the money, basically you sold the produce and use the money to develop the product, the field. And when the field or the project starts to produce, then you basically take what you call your own price balance, which is the balance after what essentially is a repayment of the loan. So those are some of the structures that most of the national oil companies have adopted. On the second leg of your question, I would say for any national oil company, I am very passionate about renewable energy and the future. If you go to the Middle East right now, Dubai, Saudi Arabia are leaders in renewable energy technology. They are researching seriously. And today, Saudi is the biggest, well, America is the biggest Russia is the biggest oil producer, but Saudi is basically controlling the market. But they're the biggest research location for renewable because they can see the future. So I am still very much of the view that all national companies, especially in the developing world, must start thinking about 10 years, 15 years down the road. Fred mentioned rightly that we need huge base load of power, of energy sources other than renewables for things like power generation, as well as aviation, shipping, and all those things that require huge base loads. But then remember that there's a lot of research going into hydrogen. They're thinking of using hydrogen instead of fossil fuels as well, which means the future they're thinking of is to basically power airplanes, power ships using water that goes through this system that basically creates energy from water. So you could, I mean, if that's the future, we all need to start adopting that and start having a strategy that will address that in the long run. So I hope that provides a little bit of a background or on that topic.
Thank you very much, Daya. Thank you very much. And I agree. I mean, we should start looking ahead. We shouldn't wait till it's now old to go on renewable energy or hydrogen and the likes. Um, I mean, fossil fuel has its terminal end, so we should start preparing for that period. So thank you very much, Daya. I'll move to Emeka, which is just going back to fossil fuel. Gas projects in Nigeria, you know, say for the LNG Train 7, not many gas projects are being concluded in Nigeria. Um, I know that Chukwemeka and I worked on a deal recently on a gas project in Nigeria. So I'm just asking, from your practical experience, what are those challenges that you see in gas projects raising project finance in Nigeria, and how can we cross those hurdles? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dio. Well, in starting, I will quickly go to. I was going to pretty much cover three broad areas. Talk a little bit about where some of the opportunities lie, because actually this topic talks about challenges and opportunities. Where are the pipelines? Then I'll talk a little bit around the regulatory regime, and then just a little bit around the commercial issues. And quite a number of the points that I was going to discuss has already been mentioned by some of the prior speakers. Just an interesting point to note, for example, in the refinery space, Nigeria is actually projected to contribute around 71% of Africa's total growth. That's Nigeria in terms of the refining sector, and to add about 1.5 MMBD of refinery capacity by 2024 to 2026. And we're looking at about 43 out of about total of, let's say, 65 planned refinery projects may come from Nigeria, if we actualize projects such as the Dangote refinery and the modular refinery drive that we are pushing forward. That's one significant area where there's significant value in terms of both investors and project components. That's an area we can look at. The modular refinery structures in terms of bridging the gap between refined products and the demands in Nigeria. Another area is in terms of the downstream gas sector, and not just downstream gas, but in terms of the virtual pipeline opportunities that exist, your LPG, your CNG. Government has rolled out a few initiatives like your National Gas Expansion Program, and all these are targeted to provide more opportunities for domestic production, because so far, in terms of domestic consumption, yes, we're not doing too bad. So for example, as at the end of last year, 2020, our LPG, coastal supplies of our LPG actually broke the 1 million ton mark. That's the first time we've done that in Nigeria. So we're actually one of the first countries in West Africa to hit that mark. So that means there's significant and even ever increasing capacity in terms of our LPG utilization. But we must then up production and supply by investing in the requisite infrastructure, so we can then match what that demand is. A significant aspect or portion of our LPG comes from LNG, who in addition to its export markets also channels a portion of its products into domestic markets. But we then need to encourage other players to begin to think around the fundamentals and to invest in some of those areas. And that's speaking generally about opportunities. Now, in terms of the regulatory aspects, we discussed certainty, predictability, and it's important to bear in mind that these things have far-reaching implications. We've spoken about PIB, passage or non-passage, how the structure is supposed to change, not just for the laws, but also in terms of the regulators, because investors are concerned about not just certainty in the laws, but also certainty in the regulators. They want to make sure that regulators don't just change every now and so often. But just to also bring in one perspective. For example, ahead of this time, this have been the key consideration from a regulatory point of view, which was typically handled by the Ministry of Petroleum Resources. It's around the composite value that will be introduced by the acquisition or whatever it is in the sector and to the company or the assets. So they are looking out for financial and technical capacity and ability to produce, that's all. We had little or no considerations for things around competition. So, but recently now we've passed a competition law, which is an elaborate legislation that regulates all companies in Nigeria. So you then begin to see that in addition to the existing considerations where budget proponents are concerned with things around securing consent, timelines for consent and its implications for project structuring, as well even the uncertainty around the consent. They now need to then contend with competition law issues, because that means historically, the government's attitude has been as much as possible to increase participation in both the upstream and the downstream indigenous participation. But now, even in doing so, your transactions must be reviewed from a competition law perspective. You must begin to look at your measures, for example, and see whether they have anti-competitive elements. You must also begin to look at some of the contracts that you have, even your operational contracts, your supply contracts, either crude or gas, whether they have anti-competitive components. This was something that we were not paying particular attention to before, but it's something that has now come to the fore. And it's important that, that even amongst lawyers, as well as the commercial parties, it's a key consideration for what we're going to be doing going forward. And that's speaking about how the regulatory landscape is beginning to evolve and change. As I already mentioned, the point around regulatory certainty. And one of these key areas comes around renewals, even securing new licenses. Things keep changing. Sometimes you're not sure. Recently, there's been a few attempts to introduce, we first started with executive orders, and then even in a few legislation to introduce hard stop dates. So if you apply for a consent, for example, and it's not secured within, let's say, a couple of months, you can assume that the consent has been, it will be deemed to have been granted. We need more of such initiatives because it's particularly important when people are structuring their transactions. Timelines are particularly relevant, particularly when you have transactions that have certain cross-border elements. You must comply with the Nigerian law regulatory regimes. You must then also comply with the foreign law elements. And in doing so, there are certain timeline considerations. For most offshore transactions, in terms of timeline, there is a bit of certainty as to process and timeline. But then you then have to dovetail that with a regime down here, where you then have a lot of those uncertainties. And then you then begin to wonder, how does that affect your deal? One other aspect I wanted to mention in the regulatory space, particularly for those involved in the downstream gas markets, transportation and the like, is, as some of us are aware, we've recently rolled out our gas transportation network code. And what are the implications of the network code? Traditionally, shippers, I mean, people who want their gas to be shipped on the pipeline, existing pipeline network, particularly NGC existing pipeline infrastructure, just merely sign bilateral agreements and they're able to work in whatever terms are favorable between them and NGC. But we're now beginning to see that the network code, which was passed last year, ought to have taken effect now, but I suspect that's been postponed, now contemplates that there's just going to be one network code. It's going to be like a master gas transportation agreement. Now, what does that master gas transportation agreement do? All the typical terms you will have in your GTA will be in that agreement. So every shipper who is shipping gas on NGC-owned or associated infrastructure needs to now begin to think of how to merge or accede to the network code. That means the flexibility that you used to enjoy in terms of negotiating your bilateral arrangements needs to change. You have structured a couple of things on that assumption. Now you go to a regime where you're pretty much, it's a cut and dry pre-baked structure. That's where you're going to transit to. And there are certain other implications, licensing, et cetera, et cetera. So that means in that entire space, if the network code becomes effective, then that means the landscape totally changes, particularly like I mentioned for those who are involved in gas transportation. So they must need to contend with how the network code and its implications will affect already existing projects, their pricing, their fundamentals, and all that are all likely to be affected. So that's one important point to pay attention to. We've already spoken to issues around your Forex, repatriation, talking about compatibility, foreign exchange. One other aspect that we may also need to mention is as it relates to export proceeds repatriation requirements in Nigeria. And typically, most project components would like, particularly lenders, would want to structure their transactions where the receipts coming from, the revenue coming from the project goes to some offshore accounts, and then they can then begin to take care of all the cash flow. But given those requirements, you must then begin to think around the project company must first repatriate the funds back to Nigeria, and then you can then begin to think, what do you do with them? And there are certain concerns around, can you do anything you want with the funds once repatriated? Can you utilize them immediately, or do you have to wait for a while? So these are additional regulatory overlaps that sort of touch on transactions in Nigeria and which one has to pay particular attention to. And this is not necessarily project specific, but actually cuts across the chain. From the more commercial points, this is the note on which I'll end, you look more around issues around, for example, taking security. And I've mentioned things around getting the necessary consent. So now, for example, in addition to securing your typical ministerial consent, you must now contend with consent from the FCCP, particularly if the transaction triggers any FCCP regulatory interface. So I'll give you, for example, in the downstream space, whether gas processing or refinery space, the recent DPR guidelines, I think it was issued last year, requires you as part of your consent requirements to go and get FCCP approval. However, FCCP may also require you to get DPR approval. So you must then begin to do a bit of a juggling act, talk to both regulators and find a way to harmonize your regulatory obligations to make sure you get the consents of both regulators to do your deal. And these are very important considerations because they may actually impact on and affect both the timeline as well as how you're structuring your deals. I won't speak too much on the typical security credit enhancements which companies will usually have to contend with. Point to note generally is that in terms of transaction structuring, you rarely in this market see either a corporate financing, for example, or a pure project financing. That hardly exists. What you typically see is more of a hybrid approach. So transactions will set off more like a project financing, but ultimately it evolves to, and you begin to see your more corporate financing type covenants, even in terms of security, sponsor support, and security. So those are things that I think important for us to also look at in terms of considerations. How to make things better, in my view, it's a bit difficult, but I think also that the more that the practitioners in the market begin to be more focused and specific in identifying some of these key constraints and then reaching out to the regulators on what we think are some of the key areas where we need to tweak a few things, I think it will help us to achieve more progress in the market. So that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Upameka. And I agree with you on that point that practitioners need to continue to engage the regulators. Just on the DPR guidelines that was issued last year, I mean, it's significant progress from the previous guidelines on obtaining consent, which essentially suggested that even the sale of one share in an entity that held a pipeline license required the minister's consent. At least the regulators have come back to say, look, even for downstream assets, gas pipelines, it's majority, a change in majority share. So at least that's some progress. So thank you very much. I will continue to engage them. I'll move to Ayodele, Dr. Ayodele. And I'm not trying to get a free summary of your book on this webinar, but can you tell us some of those transactional issues you've seen in the power space and any suggestions that you have from a policy perspective that government can take or do to cure some of the issues that we typically see in our day-to-day transactions? This is particularly important. So for example, we've had 14 solar PPAs, not one plant is in existence. So what are those steps that government can immediately do, either to kickstart or to take those 14 solar projects to financial close, or other aspects of the power space?
Okay, thank you very much. And it isn't exactly a summary of my book anyway. Okay, yeah, interesting. The power sector, when one begins to speak about it, you may spend the whole day. So I'll summarize a lot. Now, first, we need to understand how the sector should work. It starts from the consumers. If the pricing isn't right, if consumers don't pay, then the money doesn't move from consumers all the way to whether it's a gas supplier or the fuel supplier where it's renewable, where it's not a renewable power plant, say a thermal plant, or the PPA where it's just a renewable power plant. So if pricing is wrong, if it's not cost reflective, now we've moved to the regime of service reflectivity. If the prices doesn't reflect your cost of production like anything else, it will not be profitable and people won't invest. That's one problem. Secondly, even where pricing is cost reflective or service reflective or a combination of both, and people refuse to pay. So it's a Nigerian problem, right from the consumers to the market structure. I'll speak to a number of issues in no particular order, to the market structure, to government itself, to issues still around stability and ability for you to convert convert Naira to the USD and to move your money around, to issues around even bankability, single obligor limits of the banks and all of that. There are several issues. So starting from the consumers, one, pricing, secondly, electricity theft. Once you've got electricity theft, and now coupled with issues around pricing not being reflective or sufficiently reflective, you would always have that problem. There's nothing else you will do, except you want to begin to speak to subsidies. Now, the regime we've always practiced has been cross subsidy, which means, I mean, the bigger boys subsidize the younger, the smaller boys. That's one issue also. Another issue has always been, historically, the market structure has been a bit of a challenge. Recall that for a very long time, you had a behemoth being in charge of a, a vertically integrated company doing generation, transmission, distribution. So once you had this for several years, it would take time for you, even when you transition to something else, for everyone to understand that it's not a social good. It's not something you get for free or you get highly subsidized, particularly where you are even generating income from that. We speak, and I like to also combine legal issues with social issues. A lot of people are moving to the US, moving to Canada, moving to the UK, Ireland, everywhere else. Even the UAE is inviting professionals. Now, you notice that when you school or live in those countries, you are paying a lot for electricity, you are paying a lot for services. So if we don't work around that, then we won't make a lot of progress. Together with using better technology and all of that to ensure that electricity theft reduces substantially. With respect to electricity theft, NERC is doing quite a bit around franchising, sub-franchising and all of that, so that you can have individuals or people who live in a particular locality go on to ensure payment and to help with certain obligations of the discos. That's one arm. Another issue has been that historically, discos there have been challenges with project developers being able to get things done with the distribution companies. Ever so often, and I'm sure that's the experience and a number of people, even if we want to be careful and don't want to just criticize the discourse too much so that we won't have issues with our next deal. But the truth is, it's always been very difficult, whether you want to sign a DUOS, a distribution use of system, because remember, our past system is hybrid, so to speak. We do not have a single buyer model like what you have with ESCOM in South Africa. You have different people who should eligible customers to be able to buy directly from generation companies and use distribution companies only as conduit. You've got different structures, different buyers from different sellers. But it's been difficult to get deals done, particularly when you want to have those deals done with distribution companies. You want to start a DUOS and it takes 2, 3, 4 years and the rules keep changing and the terms keep changing and the pricing keeps changing. I think NERC maybe needs to do more in that regard. In terms of Ministry of Power putting out a policy and NERC implementing that policy. That's another thing. Beyond that, for a long time, you are aware that the distribution companies refuse to take power at certain points. It may well be that a feeder that feeds a particular area, there's an area where people seldom pay for electricity and there's a feeder that feeds that area. At that point, they would reject load. Of course, very recently, a new set of regulations were passed to make it punitive for them to reject load. So a lot, to be honest, a lot is going on, and I see the sector improving, but those are some of the challenges, bottlenecks, both from an enforcement point of view. See issues also around estimated billing. There have been several pieces of legislation, regulations around estimated billing, capping estimated billing. But in practice, those things don't seem to work. So it's a combination of the market structure, whether we enforce properly, whether the regulator is not wielding the big stick well enough, whether there isn't sufficient collaboration. I think that's another thing that we need to do. Maybe there's need for a sit down to ask everyone, what exactly is your problem? And if you do tell us what the problem is and we find a solution, then there will be a stick where you don't fulfill your obligation. I know very recently, I think it was November or December, or about December last year, the distribution companies signed like a service level agreement, I think with the TCN and all of that. But before now, there were performance agreements that were not enforced. Or they were, so it's a market structure. Also, there have been issues. So it's everyone. You've got to blame. I've got to blame. You'll be shocked that there are even educated people who steal electricity. There are people who would bypass meters. You understand? And even for the distribution companies, government too, for a very long time, billions of naira were owed by MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies. So once you've got a problem with marketing discipline, you've got a market problem with the structure, you've got a problem with pricing, it won't work. Say for a few people who are now doing off-grid projects, and even at that, like I did mention to you, then do have that bottleneck of reaching some form of compromise with the distribution companies. So it's a question of solutions. 1, policy. 2, collaboration. 3, actual enforcement. You know what the rules are, and if you want to play in that, sector, then you need to follow the rules. NEC has got very broad powers, even to change the board of licensed companies. So maybe some of that should be done. Electricity theft, much more needs to be done. The transmission, every now and then you hear of systems collapse. It could be total, it could be partial. Much more needs to be done. You need to have an independent system operator, separate off TCN. You understand? So those are things that need to be done. We need to even use new technologies. You hear everyone speak about blockchain. You can have, but that might need some adjustment around how electricity flows so that it's a by flow. I mean, I don't want to go into technical issues, but everyone needs to, all hands need to be on deck to achieve what we want to achieve with the power sector. But we are all at fault, from government not keeping his own bargain, to the distribution companies, to pricing, to consumers, to electricity theft. So everyone just needs a change of attitude and to work hand in hand to achieve success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're spot on there. We're all at fault. Many of us have been utilizing electricity at a discounted price for many years. Certain people still don't meet their payment obligations to their discos. Even amongst professionals, we need to also engage our clients to inform them of what the law says and have a collaborative approach to getting most of these deals done. So thank you very much, Dr. May. I think we're running out of time, so I might just go to the chat room just to get any questions from the audience. There's a question here for Fred. It says from Kingsley Onumwa. It says, Fred, don't you think the national grid is a major problem for power generation in Nigeria? Fred, would you like to take that question?
Sure. Hi, Kingsley. I think it's an interesting one, and many countries have to decide on what their grid structure and strategy is. You have in certain jurisdictions, America, for example, you have decentralized grids, and that works well because you can then have certain grids managing a load for a region rather than saddling one grid with a lot of power and demands, and then you have more technical losses and you have to do more maintenance and investments and things like that. However, the argument for the centralized grid in Nigeria, I would have thought, is because you have the politics around that. And there's a focus, especially in a federal structure like Nigeria is. The advantage of having a central is because you have inequality across the 36 states. So Lagos and Abuja tend to have better infrastructure, generally speaking, and better funding, and maybe Port Harcourt than other parts of the country. So I think one potential disadvantage, and we'll come on to the advantages, one potential disadvantage of having decentralized grid structure is you then have different regions having to manage that, and there's politics around that. But the disadvantage of the centralized grid is that you have a lot of focus on the central grid, and without enough investment, which there clearly isn't at this stage, then there's a challenge. But the solution is whichever the government chooses, centralized or decentralized, it needs to be backed up with political action and investment. So there's no right or wrong answer. But the challenge with Nigeria as it is if you just completely decentralize the grid without thorough planning and effective execution, you have inequality and patchy transmission across different regions. So there's no right or wrong answer. The question is, what is the national power infrastructure delivery strategy, and making sure whatever is chosen is effectively implemented. But there are merits and demerits for both options. I hope that answers Kingsley's question.
I believe so. I believe that was a very detailed answer to his question. So thank you very much, Fred. We're about to round up, so I'll just go through the panelists if you have any final remarks. And I'll start once again with our Leonard Silk, Mr. Uche Obiesian.
Thank you very, very much for this. I think that government policy should move towards really, really driving investment. And for that to happen, the sector will have to be de-risked a bit more. Opportunities have to be unlocked. For me, that would mean that there should be a little more liberalization of the sectors. Licenses should be granted to those who are qualified. It should not be hoarded. It should not be kept. Some other countries are giving licenses for free once you demonstrate technical and financial capability. So why are we keeping them when we're almost into the transitionary period? With what is happening there, there might be low demand for fossil fuel. So why are we wasting time as a nation? We do bid rounds for marginal fields. It will drag and keep dragging. The main acreages are not to be seen. What are we waiting for? So I think there should be a concerted effort to accelerate, the growth of the sector. Lastly, the PIB just has to be passed. And the implementation should follow immediately. Okay, so our regulators are supposed to be more business facing and as opposed to armchair regulation. They should be enablers. They should be thinking, how do we get this industry to move the way some other sectors are doing? I'm impressed, for instance, with what I see in fintech, the switchings and the card-paying systems. Somebody was telling me that in terms of card-paying system, that Nigeria is even advanced more than a number of countries in Europe and some parts of the States. So this is what we want to see happen. If we could deregulate the telecom sector and we're having what we're having today, why are we holding back the gears that ought to lay the golden eggs? Food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonard Silk. Move straight to Diodo.
Thank you. Yeah, I was on mute. I think the Leonard Silk has, to adopt the legal phrase as well, covered the field there. So I'll just add my little to cover to what he said. I think investment is very key. Infrastructure investment in the energy sector, we can't but do that. Whether it's the power, whether it's the gas or oil sector, we have to. Cash calls. The national company must try and meet its cash calls. That's been ongoing for a while now. It's one of the things that is a major issue that's been going on in the system. So that has been dealt with quickly. PIB, as Leonard Silk has mentioned, it will help with certainty. People want to make decisions on investments, but they don't know what the fiscal terms will be. in future. So it's very, very important to have certainty, especially around the fiscal and also proprietary rights that will come with this new legislation that is coming in place. Finally, I will talk about the future. As I said earlier, I'm very passionate about energy transition. It's where the world is going. And I'll just touch on what Leonard Silk said, the last thing. On telephones, in 1999, Nigeria had 30,000 or 40,000 phone lines. I remember then that you have to go to your neighbor's house or your neighbors come to your house to receive or place phone calls. They liberalized the system in 2001. I bought my first mobile phone in 2001. Now you have over 150 million lines in Nigeria, probably close to 200 million. Essentially, we did a quantum leap from 30,000 lines to 150 million lines in less than 20 years. So we may be surprised that our whole discussion around power, the whole way it's going about the transmission system and all that, we may actually be doing a quantum leap where we end up with mini grids which are renewable powered with better battery technology, because it's not just the solar panels, but the most important aspect of renewable in terms of solar is the battery technology. And this is improving every day. You have Tesla who have their power walls that can work for almost a week or longer to power an average home. So I think research and development and being open-minded to change is one of the things that is very, very critical in this energy space. So let's watch out in this space. So much is going to happen in 10 years.
Thank you very much, Diana. I'll move straight to Dr. Oni.
Thank you very much. On a controversial note, I'm quite pro-Trump when it comes to energy policy. I think fossil fuels are not going away anytime soon. I think reliance will drop. I think what I see with Qatar in terms of gas. So yes, I agree with Dio in terms of energy transition, but I think we need to stop at a bus stop without meaning any tautology, and it's the gas bus stop. We've got a lot of advantage we've got competitive advantage from gas, and I think we should utilize that. For as long as we do have opportunities around fossil fuels, from a policy point of view, I think we need to do much more to exploit our advantages until it dies out. I think I'm a firm believer in less is more. I think we need to do, from a regulatory point of view, I think NERC needs to do less in terms of regulation. Let the market regulate itself to a large extent. Maybe say for issues around protecting consumers, I think NERC, being the electricity regulator, needs to regulate less. It's beginning to look like the oil and gas industry where you have over 200 or 300 pieces of legislation. I also, energy transition, strangely, the PIB doesn't speak to energy transition, except I'm looking at the wrong version. So, and I think that's a problem in itself. Also, certainty and stability are crucial. You can't overstate those. And finally, government does still have a role to play in terms of backbone infrastructure. When you talk about telecoms, you see issues around internet connection. The problem still is the backbone. We need the backbone for power. We need the backbone for gas. Government still does have a role to play. Unfortunately, when we're making a gusher from oil, we didn't do those things we were supposed to have done, like what the UAE is doing now, or what they've done in the last 10 years. If we had used much of our income to develop the backbone, which private investors can then build upon, I think we'll be in a much better state. So those are my last words for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oni. I'll move over to Chukwemeka.
Thanks a lot. I think I'll sort of take it from where Dio stopped. Dio mentioned how we've gone from 30,000 to about 150 million or more telephone sets. But the key question is, how many of those telephones are produced in Nigeria? Let's go and check. You'll find that it's only about a fraction of those telephones, mobile phones, are produced here. Neither are any of the components produced here. We pretty much import everything. So we're having discussions around, let's all invest in oil and gas, let's all invest in oil and gas. We also need to begin to think about the market. I think we need to begin to be a bit what I call Afrocentric in approach. Nigeria must think about how do we get the entire value chain to get properly developed. We also need to break down the borders we have with our West African and other African neighbors, and then begin to think about how do we market our products to those countries. I think within Nigeria itself alone, we have a significant market on the serviced market. When you couple that, you break down the borders, and couple that with having reaching out to guys in West Africa and other areas, most of whom are taking steps. See what happened to Ghana when they were having challenges with issues getting stuff from you. They immediately switched approach, started looking at other options, FLNG approaches and stuff. So I think we should begin to think about the markets. How do we begin to grow the markets? The value chain has to be such that the optimal value is derived. We shouldn't be thinking only too much in terms of revenue. Revenue is only one of it. But I think it's more important. And the example you gave about telephones, it's very apt. How many of those telephones are produced here in Nigeria? Just a very little fraction. So we must get to the stage where we begin to see LPG stations around, CNG stations everywhere, fabrications going on, little plants, engine conversion, all sorts of elements with it. And if we do that, then our quest for energy sustainability may be at least that will be a step in the right direction. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And last but not least, Fred.
Yes, I think my colleagues have covered some very valuable, pertinent points. I think looking at all the issues that have been spotlighted during this session, it's clear to see why some international investors have withheld their investment, and maybe I've looked at some other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But we're where we are, and we want to end on a positive note and look forward. So I think we've talked about the Paris climate commitment and energy transition. I agree with the view that fossil fuels has a time limit, but if Nigeria wants to be competitive, it can focus more on gas. Let's remember that during the Stone Age did not end because there was a lack of stones. The Stone Age ended because we were not alive then, but our forefathers migrated to Iron Age and then technology and all of that. So it's very likely that given the huge amount of petroleum resources we have, that at some point it becomes a stranded asset. So I think Nigeria should be looking at creative ways to monetize gas. Unlike what we did in the past, where the big focus was exporting crude, we should try and monetize the gas to fire the power sector, which ignites the economy, boosts manufacturing, creates jobs, and makes Nigeria a hub for supplying goods and services for the sub-Saharan African region. And we could piggyback off the African continental free trade structure to aim to achieve that objective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. And thank you very much, all the participants and the panelists. It's clear that Nigeria has a very huge potential. What's important is for all to come together, work in a collaborative manner. The government ensures that they fix and sort out the macroeconomic issues, which will help generate increased desire to bring in investments that will be required to develop our oil and gas and power sectors. On this note, I'd like to conclude and say thank you to everyone once again. I'm not sure if any member of the ESQ team is on, wants to give any clue. Okay, Chidima,
Yes.
over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ebode. You really moderated everything so well. Thank you, my learned student, Mr. Ochobin. Thank you, Mr. Chupemeka. Thank you, Mr. Dio Idowu, for making it today. Thank you, Dr. Ayedeleoni. Thank you all for joining us today. The session was very robust and insightful. A very big thank you to our sponsors, JLS and Co, Bloomfield Law Practice and Advocate Law Practice, for making this webinar possible today. Thank you also to all our attendees for participating in today's webinar. Please note that our next webinar series will be on the 8th of March, where we have something special planned for women by 1 p.m., which is International Women's Day, where we will have amazing and powerful women on here talking about challenging workplace inequality against women. That will be the topic of the day, so you can't afford to miss it. Thank you once again for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.